Hey everyone, we are back with another episode of part 5 of For the BL podcast, where if you have an unpopular opinion about BL, you've come to the right place. Saying all the things you do or don't want to hear, we are here to engage with BL media from Japan, Thailand, China, Korea, and more. We're talking filmmaking techniques, narrative analysis, fandom woes, while asking questions like, why don't the bottoms move their arms? We may not be experts, but we're loud, chaotic, and we're damn sure full of opinions. Here is our next episode. You want to roll people into what we're talking about today?
Oh, hell yeah. So, speaking of controversial opinions and bottoms who do move their arms, so this week we are talking about the infamous Playboy, which just finished airing a couple weeks ago and definitely hit people in a lot of different ways in terms
You
of
are
reception.
so much kinder than me.
It's been wild.
So I guess to ease folks into this, do you want to kind of give like a run through of what Playboy was about?
Absolutely. So, contrary to what people might have read about Playboy having no plot, I would argue that it actually has so much plot. It is brimming over with plot. On the very, very highest level, with the least amount of detail, it's a mystery. It's about a guy named Nant who has gone missing and efforts to find him. Getting a little bit more detailed into it, it is also a story about Nant's twin, Nant, who has come to kind of spearhead this investigation and figure out what happened to his brother. It's about I guess four, even though first doesn't live there, the four, like, college friends that Nant had and what they know and what they don't know. It's about this club called Playboy, which is somehow the locus and the center of an increasingly large web of dangerous shit and drugs and sex and secrets that all somehow swirl back around to connect to Nant. I guess kind of I would say like the ultimate question kind of the show is like, who the fuck was Nant and what was he doing and why was he doing it?
If there was like a main thing that tied the story together, it would be that question. Who was Nant? And where is he? Why did he do the things he did? I know that the creator, or the screenwriter I should say, excuse me, Den had said that Playboy was camp and mystery. I got like kind of neo-noir vibes from it, especially like in terms of like the filmmaking and such, which we will definitely talk about. So but yeah, I would say that's a good summation of like the overall story, which is very twisty and turny and also has some really strong character work. There's a lot of relationships.
There are a lot of just fucking characters in general. Like I'm gonna see if I can remember all of them by first name. Okay, so we have Nant and Nant. We have Zoe, Porsche, First, and Captain. We have Tina, Jump, Soong, Aub, Puin, Prom, Pop, and Nut. Did I forget anyone? I think that was everyone. So yeah, a lot of characters happening in the show, and like you said, a lot of different relationships of all very many styles and kinds and twistiness and fucked upness. For me as an enjoyer of like soulmates, like derogatory, this is like catnip for that kind of shit.
I love that. Yeah, I would say one of the things, just as an aside, that I really like too, because with the amount of characters, like with the cast being so large, I feel like it could be kind of intimidating because there's a lot of fucking people. But what I really liked and what I found really unique to Playboy in terms of its story was that the characters aren't beholden strictly to their love interests. You have this huge cast of characters, but they get to interact with multiple people, which, by the by, you would be like, well, is that really that special? But, like, one of the struggles I have with Thai BLs is that Only Friends, ironically enough, is actually a pretty good comparison. And one of the issues I had with Only Friends was that as soon as like the couplings of the Brandon pairings began to happen, you had less and less focus on what should have been the core of the story, which was the friend group. We never found out why Boston was friends with any of them people. Like, you know, so in this one, I would say that it's very, very clear why these people are friends and they feel like friends and they act like friends. And they have all the trials and tribulations of friends, including, you know, times when, like, your friend is dirty. Like, pick up your fucking socks, bro. Like, that's nasty. Those little moments, I think, make Playboy especially special.
I agree, yeah. Okay, as we kind of get into talking about this, I think it's probably worthwhile to maybe like start a little bit with some of the ways that Playboy hits different than a lot of other BLs that I've watched. You know what I mean?
So I guess to discuss like why it hits different, we have to kind of set the stage here a little bit and talk about initial fan reaction. Because one of the things that made, I guess off the bat, we should tell folks like, hey, we actually did like this show. Like, this is not going to be an episode where we're trashing this show.
Yeah.
But I feel like if you look up Playboy in general, you are going to see a lot of people that are just like, oh, I didn't like it, it was garbage, et cetera, et cetera. And I think to even trace that back, we have to go to like when that first trailer, like couple trailers dropped, and how fans were already interacting with it.
Right. So, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe the first trailers dropped while Only Friends was airing.
I believe so. That sounds right to me.
Right. So, kind of like right off the bat, right? Like from the moment Playboy kind of made its introduction into the, I guess, like waiting room world of BL, where like you're getting these like longer trailers that are not actually, for Western fans, it can be a little bit confusing because they're not actually like saying this show has been made and will be airing. There is an in-between period of like, here's a concept for a show that we'd like to make that's a little bit more about like proof of concept, lining up funding, that kind of thing. So from the moment the first trailer dropped, what was so interesting about it was that it really leaned into, this is going to be a show that has a lot of sex in it. It's going to be a lot of different sex. It's not going to treat like relationships as sacrosanct. It's going to go hard. It's almost like the raunchiness of it. Like that's the word that I think of, is it's like, we're making this show and it's going to be raunchy in a way that a BL has never been.
Yeah, that sounds apt. Like, I remember showing a friend the trailer, and there was 2 trailers I think that they actually dropped, and one of them was the censored one, and one of them was like the uncensored one, and that was fun because they censored like the pizza on like the dude's piece, and I thought that was hilarious. That was so funny. For me, like some of the reactions I saw on like Twitter were a lot of people were calling this, and this is kind of a larger trend that I'm seeing in general when it comes to the discussions around BLs, that the show is, quote, softcore porn, which I thought was pretty wild. And it's more wild in hindsight with the show now finished, now completed. That kind of accusation, because that's what it felt like, an accusation. And this whole, I saw a lot of other like, you know, oh, all BLs nowadays are full of sex, and which is such a lie.
Which is a lie. Like, where are they? Like, I've watched Bed Friends, I've watched Only Friends. What else you got? I've watched Love in the Air. Where are they? Where are they hiding? Like, what avenue of BL have I, noted raunch enjoyer, just not found where y'all are watching all of the softcore porn?
Like, show me,
BL?
where are they? Like, bring them out. Like,
right. Like, where are your sources? Cite them. I would like to see the sources so I can click on the links and try for myself to see.
No, that's real though, because when I think of a lot of BLs, especially the ones that get picked up, you know, by fandom and get run with, right? None of them are very raunchy. They might have sex, but it's one of those things that it's, especially in like a lot of the more low stakes, squeakcore-esque GMTV BLs, the sex is like a stepping stone for the relationship, you know? But like, think of the popular ones that have come out in the last, you know, year or so. Like Cherry Magic was a show about sex and virginity, but it was not raunchy. Like, it was barely sexy.
No,
sorry to Cherry Magic enjoyers. I like the Japanese version. You know, I'm not trying to hate. You'll know when I'm trying to hate because I'm not shy about that. But it was definitely not. It was barely sexy. Like, let's be real. Last Twilight. You saw Last Twilight. I did not.
It was not raunchy at all. Like, I think undeniably the raunchiest thing GMMTV has ever made was Only Friends. And I would argue there's maybe like 1 or 2 sex scenes in that entire show that are actually raunchy, that are actually high heat and not like drenched in romance. Which, like, yes, having sex because you love someone is wonderful and beautiful and all of that, yes. But also sometimes it's a lot of fun to watch people have bad idea sex and then make horrible decisions about who they're having sex with.
Olivia Rodrigo wrote a whole song about this. It's literally called Bad Idea, right? Like, come on, everybody. Get, like, don't you want to be like
exactly
cool? Oh gosh, somebody's gonna misinterpret that line. But it was the fan reaction, I would say, was not warm. to say the least.
No, it wasn't.
Like, it got to the point that I saw a thread on Twitter where someone was propositing that the censorship of The Untamed, which, for folks that don't know, The Untamed is based off of a Danmei novel called Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. I can't say the Chinese name, and I don't want to butcher it. But the novel is very explicit, including, like, explicit sex scenes, which, you know...
Let's talk about the incense burner for a second. What is he doing with the sword? Anyways.
Fandom might try to ignore that exists, but that does exist, and I will never let them forget that. It is canon. It is written. It has been printed on multiple papers in multiple languages, all right? Accept its existence. But the show The Untamed was censored.
Specifically censored in that the romantic gay relationship was removed. A lot of the morality stuff too. But I think when BL fandom's talking about the censorship of The Untamed, they're talking about the relationship. And this would also go for something like Word of Honor. Same kind of thing. An explicitly romantic Danmei that in adaptation the romance is removed, kind of. For Word of Honor. Word of Honor was really like towing that line. I think in some ways they made the Word of Honor adaptation gayer by the shit they did with Scorpion. Because, like, you made the whole thing with Scorpion and the one uncle and Yi Bai Yi much gayer than it was in the book.
If he had just let his lesbian girl gang give him better advice, he could have found a better sugar daddy.
You deserve better.
Yes.
Okay, no, but to focus, yes.
We will do a Danmei episode eventually. But yeah, so... The Twitter thread had basically proposited that the Untamed censorship was a, quote, good thing, essentially, because sex, paraphrasing, obviously, belittles the romantic relationship and the romantic arc. I don't know if it's necessarily a popular opinion, but it is not an uncommon opinion I see. And I bring this up specifically because there is this kind of trending opinions that I'm seeing towards, like, the sex negative, and that, like, sex inherently is... especially if it's not monogamous, which if you've listened to our OnlyFriends episode, we kind of discuss how the show does that, and how Poor Mond is made into like a Christian morality test of the fidelity of the couples.
He's too good looking to be a chick
so
track.
Fresh. Unless GMTV gives me Non and Neo, it's like fucked up vampires and Golden Blood, I will never forgive them. Like, what a waste. It's not gonna happen.
It's not gonna happen. They're not even gonna pay to remove the wires for the wire work from Golden Blood. Like, it's not gonna happen. But whatever.
But yeah, so like this is like an opinion that I am seeing and seeing growing a lot, you know. And even if it's not said aloud, I still feel like, and you can tell me if like you see this too, or if I'm just like, you know, tripping out. But like I do see it in the way people talk about shows that feature sex, with this kind of derision.
Yeah. And I think, like, even if the, like, saying out loud actually censorship is good if it gets dirty sex out of shows, even if that's kind of the outer edge of how people are reacting, there's a shit ton of opinions that are that I see on that side. And the way people talk about sex scenes as, like, unnecessary, as always gratuitous, as distractions from the important parts. Even just the idea that, like, no sex scene is ever going to be important, really important to a story or to a character's arc or anything like that. So even if it's not, like, sex should be banished and I never want to see it, there's a lot of the kind of the increasing feeling of, like, sex doesn't serve a purpose and better shows don't waste their time on sex scenes.
I think that really summarizes it really well. Like, better shows don't waste their time on sex scenes is the vibe that I get. And I don't know if it's because I'm Latin, I just be talking too much. So thank you, my beloved co-host, for summarizing my rambles.
That's what I'm here for.
But yeah, like, that's what it feels like a lot of the discussion will be around and such. And I find it, to say in a word, annoying. I find it fucking annoying.
It's so irritating.
It's annoying because it's one thing to just, like, you know, be sex adverse or things like that, or like just, you know, find certain things unsexy. Like, that's fine, obviously, but like,
yeah,
the sex negativity from fans and like the idea that like sex can't be a part of the storytelling in and of itself. Like, I wasn't bored in the 80s, but I have watched a few 80s like erotic thrillers and such, and they're very interesting, you know. And also, Michael Douglas has never played a character I have liked.
He just has one of those faces.
Between him and Viggo Mortensen, who do you think I'm picking? But then, like, the prize was Gwyneth Paltrow, so I don't want to win that fight anyway.
Purely spectating this one.
So, like, that was kind of what Playboy, the environment Playboy kind of like was working with and the reactions, the initial reactions I saw. And I feel like that carried over into how fans, especially near the beginning of the show, were engaging with it. What do you think?
Yeah. So, to me, even if I'm just thinking about my own reaction, I think it's hard to talk about Playboy without a little bit talking about OnlyFriends. Because, to my mind, OnlyFriends was kind of saying a lot of the same, like, pre-show things. Like, the idea of, like, this is going to be a show where sex is complicated, where people have sex for multiple reasons, where people have sex with more than one person. And then OnlyFriends turned out the way that it did, where it was like, that's true in technicality. I don't feel like it ended up being true in spirit. So then all of a sudden Playboy comes along and it a little bit feels like kind of the same thing. And then we also find out that it's like, oh, one of the writers who worked on OnlyFriends also worked on Playboy. And I can't remember exactly, but there were a couple of like Twitter comments he made. I would not at all say that they were like denigrating OnlyFriends, but had a little bit of a cast of the like, yeah, so that's what OnlyFriends did. I'm working on this new project that's a little bit of, like, more my take on it, like a different perspective on it. I would also say, like, going back to the trailer for a second, one of the things that really stood out about the trailer to me was that they were immediately actually showing that they had at least filmed a whole bunch of sex scenes and that they were very different. Even in that first trailer, you had, like, a whole pizza food kink sex thing going on. You had like sex in a car in a garage. You had like sex in a locker room. Can't actually think of anything in the trailer that was just like sex in a bed. And that to me really stood out because this sort of goes along with the like when I was calling Boston a slut positive. I saw all of this and I was like, oh, great. So when you say that these are going to be different sex scenes that are a little bit more explicit, like a little bit more interesting. Okay, cool. We're backing that up. I'm much more interested in this show now than maybe I would have been kind of dealing at the time with the disappointments of OnlyFriends.
Those deep, deep, deep disappointments.
Truly. And what I found really interesting is that more than any other BL that I've seen, a lot of people formed their die-hard opinion about Playboy before a single second of the show had ever aired. So, like, there was this huge, like, contingent of people that seemed to have decided Playboy wasn't going to be good, that it was going to be softcore porn, that it was going to be prurient at best, if not actively exploitative, who then also decided to still watch the fucking show. And it got so weird.
It got really
so
weird
quickly.
really quickly. Like, I understand. Well, no, I don't understand. But I know that it's kind of like a thing for BL fandom because a lot of these shows don't have their own individual fandoms. They are all just part of like the amorphous BL fandom.
Yeah.
Like, there is very, very few BL shows that have their own singular fandom. Like, Porsche, in many, many, many ways, is an outlier to this. So,
right.
I understand that there's this, I don't know if it's like to be part of the fandom, you feel like you have to watch everything. Bless y'all that do. I'm too fucking lazy. These episodes are an hour long. A lot of Thai BLs are an hour long.
So goddamn long.
Just cannot. I can't do it. I have other things to do. I'm learning how to crochet. Like, I just don't have the time to watch every single BL that hits the webs. I just don't.
There's so many of them now, too.
Yeah, which is like, on one hand, I think that's great, you know? Especially if there's a lot of variety. I think that's awesome.
The variety is missing. I think is the problem. Oh, sorry. One thing I think is also incredibly important to mention at this point is that they were also very clear that the show was in a major way going to be about sex work. And I think that also contributed to the weirdness of it. It's not just that the sex is like recreationally weird or quote unquote weird or out there or whatever. It's that more than one of these characters was actively engaging in sex work. And anytime sex work comes up in a fandom property, anything with a fandom, I feel like that is almost always going to cause a lot of really intense reactions that are very weird.
Like, I am not an expert on sex work, and I'm not, an ex-sex worker or anything like that.
Nor am I.
Within, like, the last decade or so, I feel like we have had, or seen rather, more conversations about sex work from actual sex workers. But I do feel like there's this, you're battling the expansion of knowledge via like technology and like actual activism, on the ground activism, which is always slow going.
Yep.
Right. So with like decades of like puritanical Hays Code-esque groupthink that has penetrated media for a very, very long time, where sex workers are portrayed and have been depicted in very singular ways, and also very like dehumanizing ways. And there's never any nuance.
Right. Sex workers in media, I think, and we have like fandom friends who watch Playboy with us who are former sex workers. So not to say that makes us experts, but like conversations we had with them where it's like traditionally sex workers are like a victim on Law and Order or Pretty Woman. And like that's it.
Yeah, you're battling literally like 21 seasons of Law and Order SVU in people's minds.
Exactly.
And that is like that's a great example too, because that show is prolific. That show won't die until Mariska Hargitay is like, I'm retiring.
It won't. It'll never die.
Literal decades of that being like some of people's main consumption and depiction of sex work and sex workers. And I think that contributed, and I don't mean this in like a pious or like pretentious kind of way. We all are dealing with these same things and we all have to unlearn these same things and stuff. But I feel like you have the combination of people supporting sex workers and at the same time not actually doing any reading. And still battling and unlearning like the things that like shows like SVU taught people, and I feel like that, because one of the things that I had seen people say was that they didn't like that the sex workers and Playboys like acted, and it was weird, man. Did you see that kind of same like?
I did too. So at this point, I think it's probably worthwhile to kind of break down the groups of characters just so to be a little bit clearer about who we're talking about. On kind of one broad side of Playboy, you have the baddies. And we did not invent that name. Playboy official releases.
That was all marketing, baby.
Called them baddies first. And the baddies are for college students. At the offset, the impression we very much get of these guys is that they all come from money. They're all fairly privileged. Like, we know they're going to like one of the top universities in Thailand. So we have the baddies over there. And kind of the other broad group we have are the sex worker characters. And like kind of the four that we were introduced to initially, they all have worked or are currently working at, I would kind of describe it as a host club, really, where they're doing sex work in the confines of this club called Playboy. So the way people reacted to it, a lot of people, upon seeing how sex work was going to be treated, I think had a very big immediate no reaction, because the characters who are sex workers are, by and large, sex workers by some amount of choice. Like there's definitely like class and money issues and that kind of thing that have impacted why they've chosen to do sex work. But at the same time, they are also very explicit about like, I liked having sex, so I had to make money somehow, so why not do sex work? And I think it was such a different depiction of sex workers where these guys were not victims that are being like held hostage by an evil pimp. And they weren't just like down on their luck people who were just really waiting for the right person to come along and save them. They were just dudes who had a job. That job was sex work. And it was so different from any other depiction of like sex workers in media that I could think of that I think a lot of people just shut down. The reaction almost felt like, this is wrong. Like, this is a dangerous way to depict sex workers because that can't possibly be how any actual sex workers are.
I agree with that. That was kind of the vibe I was getting from fans. And one of the things I like about Playboy as a whole, and Den has promoted like laws in Thailand, or I should say legislation in Thailand that protects sex workers. So I would argue, based on the things that I've seen him say, that he at the very least knows sex workers. Because in my opinion, one of the things I liked about Playboy was that the sex work is very nuanced. And it feels much more like they are presenting it as a job, not something for these characters to be rescued from. And like all jobs under a capitalistic system, there are going to be sucky clients. There are going to be pitfalls. There are going to be problems. There are going to be bad days, you know? But that is not, like, no one is saving Starbucks workers. They probably should.
Right. Right.
Because, Jesus Christ, you know, I worked retail. That shit sucks. You know, like, talk about dehumanizing. You can, I mean, how many articles were there about, you know, service workers during COVID times? Like, and how awfully they were treated by the public. Like, you know, under a capitalistic system, that's what you're going to deal with. And I feel like with depictions of sex work, typically in media, it's much more of a martyrized type of story. You know, it's a victimish type of story. And Playboy doesn't play into that. I didn't mean to phrase it that way, but I'm gonna stick with that.
Well, like, one of my very favorite lines in, like, I think the first 2 episodes of the show, it's a voiceover for, like, a montage of 3 characters walking out of the club where they're all kind of saying why they got into sex work. And one of them, I believe it's Jump, says something to the effect of, like, I didn't work this hard to get this body for grandfathers and sluts. I'm gonna go out and make my own money. And, like, it's a funny line, first of all, but also, okay, I lied, it was Sing. But as someone who has done freelance, that was, like, the first moment for me where I was like, that's a mood, though. Like, I wasn't doing sex work, but yeah, absolutely, I understand the feeling of, like, fuck this. I'm just gonna go out and do it on my own instead of doing it through this fucking company that's taking a cut of what I make. And I loved that. And sort of going into the nuance too, there's also a whole bunch of different kinds of sex work. So, like, there's that kind of, like, working in a club sex work. There is camming sex work. There is, it's a little ambiguous, but I would argue there's at least the strong implication of more, like, street level sex work. And what I loved about that is maybe this is more about Playboy as a whole, to, like, get philosophical for a second. One of the things that sticks out to me so much about Playboy, and something that I feel was a very strong element of the show from the start, was this idea of there is very little, I don't know that moralizing is the word I want to use, but the way the story is presented and the way the characters are presented is not meant to kind of push toward an interpretation of morality, if that makes sense. It's a show that's kind of like, this is what these characters are doing.
I was gonna say, yeah, what you're describing sounds a lot like neutrality. Like, it's neither condemning nor justifying. Either way, it is very like, this is just the reality, which comes in many, many shades.
Yes.
Which is interesting because the show has such a grounded reality to it, while also being very campy and also very, like, the way it's filmed feels very, very noir, you know? So it's almost like it's not hyper reality, but it's almost like an alternate reality because of the coloring and such that is used, the cinematography, the transitions, like, you know, the set pieces. Oh God, the set pieces are so good.
They're so
Which
good.
Ironically was something that I saw fans deriding, was like the use of, like, flowers in a bathtub.
I don't know why people were so fucking upset about the flowers in the bathtub. Like, Zoe is an art student. Have you never been around art students? Any art student that had access to, like, a backyard bathtub would immediately fill it with absurd shit. Like, flowers would be the least of the things an art student put in their backyard bathtub. Like, calm down.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, like, you have films like Emerald Green, I think that's her name, but the director of Saltburn and Promising Young Woman also plays around with those very, like, high aesthetics, you know, those very specific surreal, that's the word I'm looking for, so the surrealistic aesthetics. And that's what I found in Playboy, was it used a lot of, like, surrealistic aesthetics, which, you know, goes into, like, the camp of it all.
Exactly.
And I thought it was interesting that fans weren't picking that up. I was like, they're just flowers in a bathtub. Like, that's not even the most surrealistic thing I've seen in a movie or a TV show.
Right? Like, even in Playboy, the flowers in the bathtub barely even register as surreal. But, like, there's so many other points in Playboy which are so much more surrealer, that, like, the fact that people got so stuck on the bathtub was so wild to me.
I find it interesting because, like, one of the things that appealed to me about Playboy, that kept me watching episode after episode, was its filmmaking, because it was so unique. Now, I haven't watched the director's other shows, or I think, no, they also directed Bedfriend, I believe, and I have watched that one. I know that they are pretty prolific. They have a pretty long resume.
Yeah, I think they have Deep Night is the one that's going right now, which we're not going to get into Deep Night.
I don't know if we'll ever get into Deep Night because I ain't
I
watching
don't know if we'll
it.
ever get into it, but there's like a really interesting like triad you could kind of talk about of Deep Night, Only Friends, and
It's
Playboy.
very fascinating. Forever disappointed.
Want to talk about a trailer that raised your hopes and then crushed them with the actual show?
Like, break up with me harder. Jesus. But yeah, so that was one of the things that I liked about Playboy was it did establish a very specific aesthetic. And for Thai BLs, for me, in my opinion, from the ones I've watched, there is very hardly ever an aesthetic to the filmmaking. I know a lot of people will go on and on about like red t-shirts and English t-shirts and like rainbow flags on a table in the background and stuff, and I think those are cute, but that's not really an aesthetic to filmmaking. Like 1,000 Stars is something that I see a lot of people praise in terms of like cinematography, and I'm gonna be real, I don't see it. It's filmed so flatly and so statically. Like that's what a lot of Thai BLs, especially like the GMTV ones, which I always point them out because like they are the biggest in the game as far as Thai BL goes. And I'm like, please throw $1 at your budget.
Yeah, I feel like if you're into BLs at all, it like there's a 99% chance you have watched at least one GMM TV one. You'd have to go out of your way really hard to not watch any GMM TV.
Oh, but they're on
BL.
every freaking rec list. Like
they are.
But like Together does not have an aesthetic. They remind me more of soaps and of telenovelas. Like if you watch those, you know that they're filmed very statically. They're very by the numbers. That's not a knock. Like that can work. You can still be really engaged.
They're like Hallmark movies.
Oh my
like it's the same sets over again. It's very similar stories over again. It's very often literally the same fucking clothes over and over again, which is fine. Like a lot of people really look forward to Hallmark Christmas movie time, but like there is a template at GMM TV and they don't stray very far from it almost ever.
Yeah, and I feel like if we're going to talk filmmaking, you have to do it on that curve where, like, in my opinion, no, Together and 1,000 Stars aren't especially well filmed. They're definitely not uniquely filmed in any meaningful way.
No.
And Playboy's is. Like, hot fucking take, Playboy is filmed better.
It truly is. There's so many things I want to say about Playboy that I keep like trying to prevent myself from bouncing around to thing after thing after thing. So like if we talk about the pilot, right? I think like you and I had talked about like and like with other friends, we were like really excited for it, but also a little bit trepidatious, right? Like we'd all kind of been let down by Only Friends. Like Copy A Bangkok has a little bit of an uneven track record with stuff they've done in the past. So going into the pilot, it was one of those, like, I think for me at least, I was like excited, but trying not to get like super hopeful, you know? And what I loved about the show right off the bat is it established a couple ground rules for the universe we were in that were unlike any other BL I'd watched. So it established this kind of rule of this universe, which is that most of these characters have already had sex. This is not going to be a show that's about people falling in love before they tenderly lay their arms unmoving with their virginity taken to soft violin music. These characters have sex. These characters also have kinky sex. They have active sex lives. They watch porn. They are very connected to their sexualities, and those sexualities are integral to understanding them as people. And for me, I was like, this is fucking great. I love this because this is more how, like, if I think about like my own sexuality, I'm like, this is much more relatable to me than Kiss episode 5, sex scene episode 10, breakup episode 11, fix it episode 12.
Don't call Dangerous Romance out like this. Like...
Well, and I think I wasn't sure how like much of a running start they were gonna get with sex, and then you watch it and you're like, first scene, Zoe's birthday, and we have hired a sex worker to make Zoe lose his virginity, and it's like, oh, okay, all right, so we're getting like right into this. And as a side note, the literal "I want to draw you like a French girl" thing is still the funniest moment in the fucking pilot. Like, and then even still in the pilot, there's a pizza delivery man fantasy, which again I really enjoy because it's to step back for a second. I think if I have to explain the way Playboy is different to me than any other BL I can really remember, is that to me, Playboy feels aggressively queer, like specifically queer. It is relying on queer tropes. It is like conversation with queer media. And I think that is often missing in BLs. So, like, to kind of come out of the gate with, like, we hired you a sex worker because you're still a fucking virgin. Like, what's going on? Going right into something like the sexy pizza delivery man shows up. And first is just like, I could eat the pizza. I could also just get on my knees in this bathroom and blow you. Like, the energy of these characters, it backed up what we were told we were gonna get. Mm-hmm. And that was very thrilling.
It was also just refreshing to see, like, the lack of shame. Yeah. You know? And I want to go back to what you said about, like, the show feeling queer, because I want to talk about costumes real quick. Because I would argue, in my opinion, like, the costuming, for one, in the show is just amazing. Like, I'm a costume...
It's so exceptional.
I'm a costume hoe. I love costumes. I love costuming. It's one of the reasons why I find the whole t-shirt conversations, like, to be really shallow, because I'm like, that's just not how costuming works. But anyway...
Not a single GMM TV character would ever show up to a small piece of light waterboarding in, like, a full cropped black leather jacket, pants, cropped shirt. Fit.
You already know what I'm going to say, but Mew couldn't even wear the fucking booty shorts.
Not even the booty shorts. Not even the booty shorts.
Like, but these felt like characters that I could meet at, like, Pride. They felt like characters that would march in Pride in, like, the parade. Like, that's what they felt like. Like, and it was just really refreshing because, you know, I don't see that a lot in BL. Like, I've seen a lot of conversations about, like, oh, this show feels very queer, this show feels very queer. I know Lonely Writer? Is it Lovely or Lonely?
Lovely Writer.
Lovely Writer, yeah. We've been talking about that recently because you started watching it.
It's so slow. It's so slow.
Speaking of shows that have a lot of shame around sex, anyway.
Oh my god. Anyways.
But I had seen a lot of people, one of the reasons I even bothered watching was because I saw a lot of people say that it felt very queer, it had a very queer narrative. I did not finish that show, full stop, total honesty, did not finish that show, thought it was boring as all fuck, and I also didn't really feel that it was super queer, in my opinion. And I feel like when we have those discussions, or when, you know, we see these discussions in terms of, like, you know, media and like a larger macro sense, it's always very specific types of stories, right?
Yes.
And Playboy, in my opinion, is very, very queer show. It feels very, very true to, like, queer life, queer community, especially, like, what I know of it, in a way that is not nearly the same as Lovely Writer. Like, I feel like the writer and Lovely Writer would run, personally. We could not vibe.
How did you even end up writing a BL? The world may never know. Anyways, kind of thinking about it, I feel like a lot of BLs, especially in that kind of GMM TV space, like, their perspective on the sexuality of their characters is, we're not different because we're gay. We shouldn't be treated differently because we're gay. Legit. Absolutely. I'm down with that. But what's refreshing about Playboy is that Playboy, to me, feels very much like we are queer. We want to be seen as queer. And this show does not think about straight people at all.
At all. Like, not even a little bit.
And it's amazing.
Yeah, it is. That's where, like, that kind of vibe of shamelessness is. Mm-hmm. I think, in general, we just need a variety of, you know, queer depictions. Like, I don't care about Heartstopper. I will never care about Heartstopper, but I am vastly happy that it exists, you know? Yes. But in conjunction to Heartstopper, there should be more Playboys, you know?
Exactly.
Where, like, the characters can show up, like, that party scene with everybody's fits, fucking immaculate.
Right. And, like, tying it to fashion, like, to costuming specifically. I'd written something for Tumblr, and, you know, Tumblr meta, because that's what we are. That, like, one of the things that to me makes the Playboy characters so vivid is that they are clockable. I don't think you can look at the majority of these characters and not see them as queer. Like, the way they dress, the way they present themselves is not designed to be overlooked. Mm-hmm. Like, the way they dress is communicating who they are very openly. And what I also really love is that I feel like a lot of BLs will kind of tend to, like, costume everyone in the same age group very similar. Yes. especially with stuff set in university. I mean, that's uniforms, but like the costuming often is not doing a lot. What Playboy does is more like what something like Kin Porsche did, and I would argue to a higher level than Kin Porsche did. But in the sense of like, if you see Vegas wearing that like silky button down astrology black shirt, no one else in that cast could wear that shirt without you looking at it and going like, what's up with that? Like, why is he wearing this shirt?
Yeah.
What is the point of
Yeah.
this? And that's the same thing about Playboy. And when there's so many characters, it's so important to like add depth to these characters in that kind of way. So like Nant in full leather black fit, that's not something Zoe would ever
No.
wear.
He would look like a drowned Pomeranian.
He would. That's not something like Puan would ever wear. And it makes the character so much more vivid, and it makes the show a lot of fucking fun to watch, because every single thing Nant puts on is the most insane piece of clothing I've ever seen in my entire life.
And it's great.
The whole white, like, I woof you thing that he wears to talk to prom that first time is the choicest of choices.
And I think that's, like, in terms of costuming, like, those are silhouettes. Like, every character has a very specific silhouette and a very specific style. So that way, you glean not only who they are as they walk into a room, but you also glean things about their personality, you know, in a subtle way. And that's what I love about costuming in film, because you can infer so much about a character's personality just via their clothing, you know? Yes. And that's missing, in my opinion, especially for a lot of Thai BLs. Taiwanese BLs I find are a lot better at this.
Yeah.
So, but they also have much shorter run times because here's the kicker about costuming. Costuming is actually very expensive.
It is.
And when you have an hour of time to fill, you're not going to have as much budget for your costume. So you have to balance it out. So like for Playboy, you can tell that they sacrificed like having extras.
Yeah, there are almost no extras in this show.
You could probably count them on like one hand.
Right. Truly, until everything starts happening with Jason Lee, I think the only extras are the rugby team. I think that's
And they definitely filmed all their scenes in a single day.
They absolutely
did. They were on the call sheet for one day, you know, and you can tell that like they were able to allocate their budget where like the set pieces were important and the costuming was important, and those were just more important than having extras. Like I remember a critique of the early episodes was that the party that they were having, there was nobody there, and I'm like, yeah, but I understand why, because they rather have the house look unique, you know.
They were also so incredibly smart about making the lack of extras in any given scene or situation feel very purposeful. So like, yeah, there's nobody at that party, but it works in the context because like this party with what happened with Zoe and Jump has already not gone the way it was supposed to go. We see that Zoe has dipped out of this party to... What I love about Zoe's like mind palace room is that if you think about it, it cannot possibly exist in like the place that they live. It's like architecturally impossible for that room to be part of where the house is. But like you've already had Zoe so like not into what's happening that he's escaped into his mind palace. And it's like, yeah, so now you've made the lack of extras a way to enforce the way Zoe feels about this party that he didn't ask for, and the fact that his birthday has become about like his fucking virginity, whether he wanted it to be or not. And I feel like I don't notice the lack of extras. Like there aren't moments where I'm like, this would make more sense if like there were more people. So the thing that gets me is like there's so many BLs where they're like, this is the hottest party spot in town, and I'm like, that is 12 people that are dancing around a table, and no matter how you frame this shot, it does not look like a crowd because it's 12 people that are at the hottest party spot in town.
Do I dare bring up the Only Friends Hostel Halloween party?
That party would have been such an embarrassment if you were actually trying to like establish the hostel as a party spot. Like you would just never post pictures of it. You just wouldn't.
Yeah, Fry Festival realness. But yeah, like for me, Playboy is very purposeful. Is like a turn of phrase that I would use for it. Like in terms of its filmmaking, its story, like for Only Friends, we actually mentioned framing devices. We talked about framing devices and how good the editing was in like that first 5 episodes, and how they had used framing devices like the confessionals and what was another one that they used?
Like the time thing with Sans episode.
Then they kind of just dropped it, which was part of our joint disappointment. But Playboy actually has its own kind of framing device. It's like precursor framing device. You always have like a news report at the beginning of an episode that talks about some sort of report that also is, if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, also has this subtext about how society is failing the most vulnerable. And usually that news report will be interwoven with like the main storyline of whatever's happening in the episode. And that to me is so purposeful and so thoughtful in terms of its storytelling. And I also love the way that it's filmed, you know, with like all the flashes and the
Yeah.
newspapers and the news reports and the headlines. I can't read any of it because it's all in Thai.
They are all translated now, which they were not for the first few episodes, which was so disappointing. But I believe they are now all translated on Gaga Ooh La La.
That is very exciting because it's one of those things where like I know I'm missing context. You know, and that kind of happens when you're engaging with media that's just not in your like native language. I'm used to that, but it was still, I still felt the energy and I still understood because there was always a voiceover too from like a newscaster or something. And I loved those parts of the episodes and just how it was used in terms of story because of the way like it would set the tone for the episode. And like I feel like Playboy has a huge rewatchability factor.
I agree. I personally have rewatched it at least once.
Yeah, there's so much going on, and then there's so many things that when you rewatch it, you know, you're like, oh, so this is why this happened, or this is why this character reacted that way, or this is informing why this character has been behaving this way towards these other characters, etc., etc. And to me, that's just exciting. Like, that's just an exciting story. So, for people to make posts about, you know, like the stupid meme post with the book about how Playboy doesn't have a plot.
That was so unnecessary. That was just an unnecessarily catty fucking post.
I feel like, you know, I have to wonder, one, if like you finished the show or you haven't, and two, like if you were paying attention or if you were just too quote unquote grossed out by the sex.
Right. And there is a lot of it. Like, they were very upfront about that there was a lot of sex, and there is. What I think is interesting about that sex is that it's all very different. They don't feel like interchangeable sex scenes.
No.
Because it's almost like the way characters have sex can say something about them as people or about the fucking story we're telling. I'm not mad about it. It's fine.
That sounds like fake news. Like next you'll tell me peekaboo framing isn't real.
Like, I could spend an entire episode of this podcast just talking about whatever the fuck Not and Prom have going on.
Oh my god, I love them so much. Their relationship is wild and I want to see them burn something down, like just an entire building.
To take like a very brief moment to tell one of my like favorite stories of like the watching experience of Playboy is Not in Prom have this insane sex scene. It's like the first time they like really like fuck, and there's like collars, there's leashes, there's masks, there's latex, like there's a lot happening. And after it aired, we were kind of talking in the group chat, and I said something to the effect of like, I think people are sleeping on the fact that like Prom was wearing thigh highs during this whole thing. And every single one of you went, what do you mean Prom was wearing thigh highs? And I like went back and took a screen cap, and I was like, Prom's legs in thigh highs. But like the sex scene was so interesting and there was so much going on that like none of you had noticed it. And I feel like in some ways that's such a great encapsulation of the rewatchability of Playboy. That like in any other BL, one of the characters showing up in black thigh high stockings would be like the thing you most knew about that show. It would be like with Bed Friends. If you haven't watched Bed Friends, you still probably know about the kitty sex scene. That's what it would be. But there was so much happening just even in that sex scene that the thigh highs were truly nothing more than costuming.
And what brilliant costuming. And that goes back to like Playboy's being very purposeful. Like I can't agree with people that say it has no plot. We've already talked about how like the whole just sex thing is kind of like derivative and whatever, but Playboy has a lot of story happening and it's very, very character driven and it's very purposeful in its filmmaking, in its costuming. Like there's some really amazing shots in the show. And like there are some shots that I find like they're not great. I don't think there's actually any sound issues.
The only thing I could think of is just a couple like dubbing moments, but like those were just kind of unavoidable. Like they couldn't reshoot the whole scene, so that just kind of was what it was.
Yeah, it was one of the things where it is what it is. Es que lo es. But for me, like as someone who just likes film, I like watching things that both look pretty or are fun to watch. and it's why I hate Ant-Man Quantumania so damn much, because what an ugly fucking movie. Forget the story, what an ugly viewing experience that was on my eyeballs. And Playboys is just interesting. It is top to bottom, no pun intended for that, interesting viewing experience. And then it has a really interesting story. Like, it's noir, it's campy, it's a mystery, whether it's a murder mystery or not. Like, you don't know. I also want to talk about, because this was something that we both saw a lot of in fandom, and you are actually kind of an expert on this. But I do want to talk about camp, because Playboys has been called camp. Den, the screenwriter, has said specifically Playboys is camp, or at least embodying camp, in terms of genre. And I saw a lot of people that did not think Playboys was
But
camp.
could not provide an example of something that was fucking campy.
Yes.
Not that I asked this of several people and never got an answer.
Do you wanna kind of take us away on that? Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath.
Okay. So, when we're talking about camp, we're not talking about summer camp. What we're talking about in the kind of queer studies realm is camp as a particularly queer aesthetic and way, I would say, of conveying meaning that relies on a lot of like in group queer signaling. I do apologize for how obnoxiously academic that sounded, because it is obnoxiously academic. So, when we think about things that are campy, some of like the more well-known examples would be something like Rocky Horror Picture Show is very campy. Mommy Dearest is very campy. Drag queens are often considered campy, though, as drag has kind of through RuPaul become much more normalized, that kind of becomes a question. Is it as campy as it once was? So, when you're talking about camp, the thing that gets a little bit difficult is that it is hard to define, right? So the kind of the definition I've ended up at after I wrote my undergraduate thesis about camp is that camp is a queer way of treating serious things very trivially and treating unimportant things very seriously. And I know that doesn't make sense. That's actually one of the things I like about camp, is in some ways, the more you try and talk about it, the less sense it makes. So when we're kind of specifically looking at Playboy, the things that make it really campy to me are things like the way information is given to an audience. So, early show example to me that's very campy is Zoe, who we have been told is a virgin, and not just as a virgin, but has very strong, like, negative reactions to being touched sexually. I think he has a line where he's like, sex is for everyone, but maybe it's just not for me. However, in like the very early times of Zoe trying to have sex with Tina, the way they kind of convey how he's feeling about this is like by providing the dialogue that's going through his head, but it's not Zoe narrating. It's Japanese animated porn dialogue. So like what you're getting is these characters from this anime porn that it's like, no, we shouldn't, or like, no, we can't, please don't, please stop. That to me is campy because that is a very unobvious way of telling you how Zoe feels about what's happening. But it tells you a lot about Zoe, and the sort of ridiculousness of it makes it hit in a very special, very particular way. And even using that example, that continues on. The next time they do it, you have the same kind of anime porn dialogue going on. The time after that, where they're, as Tina and Zoe kind of do more and more sexualized things, one of my favorite, like, translated subtitles in the whole show is there's a moment where it's like Japanese anime porn sound with a heavy Thai accent. And that's character
I
growth.
remember that.
That's a way of showing character change. That's not something that's ever been done. Like that's not how like storytelling tells you convey that kind of thing. But it works. And what I like about it in terms of the campiness of it is it has style to it. It has a cheekiness to it, I would say too. It is a way of conveying this idea that is not holding your hand toward understanding what's happening. It is simply presenting this as this is what has happened. If you can't understand it, then that is not the show's problem. That is not Zoe's problem. They have told you everything you need to know to understand what is happening. Now it is on you to understand it. And that overall for me is something I really love about how the show is structured. It plays so much with expectation. It plays very much with the idea of like what is and what's true and what's happened, and all these kind of solid things that in most stories that would anchor the narrative, like this thing happened here and it happened this way. But what Playboy does is says this thing happened and lets the audience say, oh, that happened, so that must mean that this character has done this character has done that, this is who this character is. And it doesn't question that at all. It just keeps telling the story. And then an episode later, or an episode after that, all of the sudden we come back around and it's like, oh, yeah, you remember. So, like Porsche, we remember Porsche, who behaved very badly towards Jump, enough that you're kind of set up to be like, Porsche seems like a shitty person. I don't know why people are friends with him. Like, I don't like this. And then the show comes back and they're like, oh, here's something new to learn about Porsche. He actually has an incredibly abusive adopted father who is not just physically abusive, but sexually abusive. And then all of a sudden, you're like, oh, that means what I thought I knew about Porsche was wrong from the get-go. And how does that change everything I've thought about this story from the beginning?
Which contributes to the rewatchability that we had mentioned earlier. And I kind of want to go back to what you were saying, like in terms of camp. Like you named Mommy Dearest specifically, which is considered like a camp classic. And for folks that may not know what Mommy Dearest is a movie starring Faye Dunaway, which is a biopic off of a Golden Age Hollywood actress named
Joan Crawford. If you want to look it up, it is spelled Mommie, Dearest.
Yes. And there's a very interesting kind of like YouTube deep dive on the production of the movie. And it is based off of Christine Crawford's memoir. And Christine had written what is considered like one of the first kind of Hollywood kid, child memoirs of the time. And it was very controversial when she did too. And the movie is based off of that memoir loosely, you could argue. So, Mommy Dearest was not intended to be a camp movie. It was actually intended to be like a very serious biopic. In today's kind of modern terminology, you would probably say like it was intended to be kind of Oscar baity biopic, And it did not turn out that way. You had mentioned how like, with camp and stuff, like it will kind of make fun or blow out like serious subject matter, and in a way that's surrealistic almost, to borrow a word that we were using earlier. And in Mommy Dearest, that's what you see, because the film is dealing with child abuse, and it is not dealing with it in a way that feels true.
Yeah.
And it's one of those films that I find really interesting because the subject matter is so real. Mm-hmm. But, like, what is happening in the movie, it's not that it feels cartoonish.
It's melodrama, is what it is.
It's melodrama.
It's drama taken to absurdity.
Yes. And I feel like that's camp. And also, for me, a lot of what makes camp is it has to have a strong aesthetic.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, if you look at other kind of camp classic movies, like you mentioned Rocky Horror, there's also Showgirls.
I would argue Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, too. But I'm a Cheerleader.
Yes, I was just going to mention that one. Valley of the Dolls is another one. And if you watch any of those films, they all have a very strong aesthetic. Showgirls especially, and again, Paul Verhoeven more than likely did not intend for that to be camp so much as satirical. But, he also intended for Starship Troopers to be satirical, and that didn't work out. But Showgirls has a very strong aesthetic, and it is also, in the same way Playboy's is, about sex and sex work in a way. And if, you can get through some of like the more overactingness of it all, you just embrace it. There's one scene in Showgirls, it's an assault scene. I can't watch that personally. Yeah. So heads up for folks that may be interested. Definitely check Does the Dog Die? But it is a very viscerally aesthetic movie. Like every scene is dripping with aesthetic, and like the costumes in Showgirls are fucking phenomenal. Like, and the makeup and the hair and everything. I mean, it's about Vegas showgirls, but I've seen other movies set in Vegas that do not embrace that stylism, but I'm a Cheerleader, I think, is kind of spiritually very in the same vein as Playboy's.
I was going to say, if you're going to watch any one of these movies, I would say, But I'm a Cheerleader.
Yeah, if you want a movie that also uses a lot of color.
It does.
In very purposeful ways and such, in the same way Playboy will tend to use a lot of color and a lot of screens and things like that, and feels like that kind of surrealistic. But I'm a Cheerleader is that movie, and again, that is considered a camp classic. So for me, I wrote like a whole little mini essay on it on Tumblr, because
It's a great essay.
In my defense, somebody asked.
The people needed it.
And I feel like there's a consensus kind of like within, just the macro pop culture discussions that camp is just a movie that is bad but fun to watch. And I disagree with that.
To me, that sort of aligns a little bit with the idea of like a lot of people today seem to be like, oh, camp is like RuPaul's Drag Race. And I'm like, I would argue RuPaul's Drag Race is not particularly campy. Like, it's a competition show. It's like, so you think you can dance? It's like American Idol. It's about drag queens. But campiness there is very dependent on the specific drag queen and whether that drag queen engages in campiness, if that makes sense. Kind of looking at But I'm a Cheerleader, which if you haven't watched it, pause, go watch that, and then come back. A lot of, I think, what camp relies upon too is an element of in-group language, an element of like something that exists that's funny to like you and another queer that a straight person wouldn't even notice. So I think the easiest example in like But I'm a Cheerleader is casting RuPaul as the counselor at this conversion camp. That's so campy and it's so fucking funny.
It's so
If
funny.
you don't know who RuPaul is, and at the time RuPaul was not RuPaul's Drag Race RuPaul. RuPaul was a very famous drag queen, but not nearly as well known as he is now. But it's incredibly funny if you know who he is, but it also doesn't make the story inexplicable or like confusing if you don't. And I think a lot of what camp is, and I think maybe more so now than it was in like the 80s or 70s, 80s, I think a lot of camp is sort of like recognizing like in-group language or doing things that are going to hit for a specific audience very differently or more specifically. So like for me, again, if we go to Playboy, one of the things I really love about it that a lot of people, even queer people who were saying like, yeah, I'm very versed in camp and queer studies, things they didn't seem to notice, which was that how much of kind of the early meeting episodes are grounded in specifically gay fantasies and often like specifically gay erotic fantasies. So like the idea of the pizza guy showing up and fucking the pizza guy, the idea of like sex in a locker room, very like kind of staples of gay fantasy, the idea of the guy who's like been bullying you and mean to you actually being really into you and you have to fuck about it. All of these things are kind of exist within a canon of queer stories, and I love the way Playboy references it. And to me, this also underscores why Playboy feels queer, because it's showing these characters doing things that I understand to be queer, and I love that shit. I think it's great.
Yeah, I think we've kind of defended Playboy quite a bit, and we've kind of outlined like our reasons for liking it, and the filmmaking aspects of it. Like the show has really good transitions. The show has really good cinematography in terms of like color. I love the way the show uses color. I love the way the show uses screens.
The way they use projections is another thing people really hated and didn't understand, but I loved as such an interesting and cool way to be like, here's what the inside of this character's head looks like. No, we will not be explaining it because nobody ever explains what's happening inside their head, but this is what it looks like. Take from that what you will.
Yeah, the use of projections, the use of billboards,
Yes.
like signage. There's a great scene with two characters, and they're deciding to enter a relationship, and the sign behind them says "Handle with care." And I think that's phenomenal. Like that's the type of like subtextual, subliminal messaging that's really interesting, to see. And this is what I mean about aesthetic. Like, I like the story of Playboy a lot, but as just a film nerd, like, as someone that just likes to watch shit, like, it's ironic because I'm lazy, which is why I mostly watch movies instead of TV shows, and it's hard in a TV show to really build like a by the by like unique aesthetic, you know, because it's budget and stuff like that, and you know it's a long time, and like Twin Peaks, I think, is another show that has like a very strong aesthetic that people really responded to, but it's also very cerebral and it's very surreal, and I feel like with Playboy, it follows a lot of these beats of camp and aesthetic in terms of its filmmaking and how that inscribes the story that is almost too unique for the genre.
Yeah.
And for like the genre as it is right now in terms of Thai BL. And what I kind of hope to see is like with Rocky Horror, because no matter what James Somerson has said, Rocky Horror did not do well.
Rocky Horror did not do well at all. Tim Curry did not fucking want to be in Rocky Horror because he knew it was not going to do well.
Yeah, like Rocky Horror didn't do well, but I'm a Cheerleader wasn't a gangbuster at the box
No.
office either. Mommy Dearest got eviscerated by critics. You know, Showgirls also absolutely eviscerated by critics.
Yeah, one more thing about camp. Camp and cult classics are extremely like entwined. The majority, I would say, of movies that are considered camp classics are also cult classics that people fucking hated when they came out, and then slowly gays started watching it and were like, "No, actually this is fucking fabulous." Is it good? That's not the point. It's compelling.
That, yes, exactly. Like again, Mommy Dearest wasn't intended to be camp, but like drag queens fucking ran with it.
Yeah.
And if you go to a drag show, you will typically see a Joan Crawford drag queen.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
she's just a part of the culture now, you know, because we've adopted that shit. And what I hope for Playboy in the future is that people will go back to it and realize, like, oh yeah, no, this got a bad rap. Like
Yeah.
this got kind of an unfair shake. And there was actually a lot here. There was a lot of good here. And there was a lot of actually interesting things being done and being said here. Again, the show is so nuanced in its portrayal of sex and sexuality and sex workers and sex work in general. And I just want it to get its dues.
Me too.
Like, however long I have to wait, you know, but I really do hope that it follows its predecessors in like the camp canon of people disliking it when it first comes out and then going back to it maybe after some time has passed and you know everybody's read at least Susan Sontag's notes on camp.
Please read Susan Sontag's notes on camp. It's an older paper. I don't even love Susan Sontag, but like if you want to kind of very tip your toes into camp in a little bit of more like a queer studies sense, Notes on Camp is not that long. It's also structured as a list, which is helpful, and it will, I think, hopefully at bare minimum give you something to think about.
Yeah, and I will include it in like the further reading notes that are always available on our website and such for folks. You know, we always try to have references and articles and things like that to expand upon what we talk about. Because I think that's kind of like the goal is like Playboy, like it starts a conversation. There's so many different threads to Playboy that there's a whole Playboy Discord.
It's called the Playboy Lounge.
Yeah, and I see so many interesting conversations in that Discord. So many people are getting so much from it, you know? And I love that specifically because I'm sorry, but how much can I really talk about 1,000 stars? Like,
right. You know.
Like there's not a lot. It's very by the numbers romance, which is not a bad thing. It's just like there's not much else to it, you know? There's not much to talk about.
Exactly.
Which is you know, again, fine, but like for me, yeah, Playboy sticks out amongst a lot of the Thai BLs that have come out, and maybe it just came out too soon.
Maybe.
So, what are your thoughts to kind of like leave listeners with, you know, as we kind of wrap it up?
All right. So my thoughts to wrap this up is like if I'm kind of looking at it and trying to say like what about it worked for me? What were the parts I enjoyed in the viewing experience? I love how much this is a show that does not hold your hand. And I think that's again part of why some people did not like it. But like this is a show that's not holding your hand with morality. It's not telling you this is good, this is bad, but it's also a show that's not actually even holding your hand with what's happening. And I found that really rewarding because what it meant was pretty much every episode, my perception of a character was completely upended by finding out new information about them that also still made 100% sense for them as a character overall. I think also this is such a meticulously constructed show And I think if you are kind of willing to give it the time, and I will be honest, in a first watch through, episodes like 2 and 3 feel a little bit slow. Because I remember when they aired, we were kind of talking about it. Like the pilot, we really liked, the 2 and 3 a little bit slow, but with rewatchability, they will hit very different. So I would say this is a show I think that is worth being patient for. It is worth saying, I don't understand why this is happening. Like, what is the point of this? And continuing to watch anyways, because on pretty much every level, I think you will get rewarded by the strength of revelation. One of the things, like we'd again kind of talked about in the group chat, was that for us, it's typically pretty easy to predict where the story of a BL is going to go, even if it's not as specific as like the GMM TV, like episode 5 kiss, episode 11 breakup. But with Playboy, we were all consistently like, I'm not sure at all what's going to happen here. And we were talking about like theories and potentials and possibilities and all that kind of thing. So I'd also say if you can watch it with someone else, that's also fun. But I think sometimes people see Playboy as a show that was trying to trick them and not a show that is about a mystery that is letting you experience revelation along with the characters. So, yeah, I would say it is a show that somehow manages on pretty much every level to back up every thread that is dropped, that manages to surprise you about characters, that manages to come together in a like devastating way, one that manages to very successfully balance as many characters as it has. Like, I think it is truly astonishing on a technical level how well all of these characters feel realized and like they got the screen time they needed, even though there are like 14 of them. And I think if you give yourself a little bit of room to be a little confused or to be uncertain, you will get rewarded for it. And it is a show that will stick with you in a way that I think a lot of BLs don't. And I think that is a very fun thing to have from a show.
I agree. Like, I would say that, again, the show is so rewatchable because there's so much information that it parses out to you. And that's what makes an interesting, mystery, especially like an ongoing mystery. And for me, the filmmaking is so engaging if you like that sort of thing. Like, you have to be able to embrace the aesthetic.
Yes.
You have to be able to put away the CinemaSins hat and embrace the more surrealistic view of the aesthetic. That while they are dealing with very heavy topics, and we've been kind of ambiguous because of the plot twists, it's something that I feel like you have to go in sort of not fully unknowing, because there are some triggers and such. But luckily, the show also has
a very extensive trigger warning list at the beginning, and I would say not a single one of those is like unnecessary. So
yes,
definitely give those like a thorough read. And hell, if you really want to know about one particular one, feel free to message us and I'm happy to give you some details about any one of these specific triggers. I'm happy to do this.
Yeah, we're not looking to upset people. Well, not in this way. Make people a little salty about opinions, maybe. Depends on how chaotic I feel that day. Just how chaotic Taylor Swift pumpkin head I feel that day in particular, spiritually. But yeah, for me, I just give it a shot. And I know it's kind of ironic because, again, I'm lazy and I usually only give shows maybe 2 episodes if they're both an hour long, because that's 2 hours. That's a whole movie. But I really do think that Playboy is unique. I think it's, special in a really interesting way. And it was just, exciting to watch. And I feel like fandom kind of didn't give it a fair shake. And I think that's kind of sad because it is such a queer show. Like, truly, deeply, unapologetically queer.
And I think what was hard for me, even kind of looking back on it now, even now, the way people are still talking about Playboy after it's finished airing, is that it wasn't just that a lot of people didn't give it a fair shake, it's that they were very mean about not giving it a fair shake. It got hard if you liked it to see all of these posts being like, Playboy has no plot. There's one post I remember just because it still made me so upset because these characters are so queer that said something to the effect of like, this show doesn't make sense, so I'm watching it like I would watch animals in the zoo. And I'm just like,
Oh, I remember that one.
probably because I didn't stop talking about it for 2 days. But like, so much of the reaction was that. It wasn't like, I don't like this. I think this is boring. I don't think this is necessary. It was a very concentrated effort to like delegitimize the show and to also be like very specifically shitty to the people who did like it. And that fucking sucked. Like I'm not going to pretend I don't have feelings. Like that sucked ass. Especially after I was so quiet through all of the fucking Trust JoJo posts and I'd never said a word.
You were a real trooper because you didn't say
I
shit.
didn't.
I did. I definitely said some shit.
No, I was just like the little minion sitting on the like armchair of your throne going like, yes, Pikachu, we should tell the people that they're wrong about Boston.
Well, it was annoying. Mamita didn't raise someone to be quiet. But yeah, like the zoo one in particular, I felt was very. It felt very much like putting the community in boxes, you know. And this is again a more granular thing. You have the discussions of like no kink at Pride, and that's kind of what the reaction of Playboy felt like. It felt like they were like, we can have our not me's, and those are like the good gays, but you can't have the Playboys because those are the unrespectable.
That's
gays.
exactly what it was. Like something I read, I also mentioned this, where it's like, what bothered me so much about the reaction, especially from other queer people, was that when assimilationist gays or shitty straight cis people are talking about like, you know, bad queers, ones that are making us look bad, ones that are like the reason the community is not accepted, they're talking about gays like this. They're talking about these characters who are obviously unapologetically gay. And like I'm gonna preface this by saying I understand that like reclaiming language is a very big thing, but the way like I've ended up thinking about it as someone who's, you know, maybe spent some time in a kink club in my life, maybe like had a gender thing happening here, is it's like this is one of the few shows, not just in BL, that like anywhere ever that I can think of that is about faggots. And I understand that's a very heavy word for a lot of people, but it is about queer characters who revel in being queer and who are not interested in like assimilation. And I get a little bit emotional about that because those characters, which are the ones that resonate with me, they're so rare. There's so few of them. And then here's the show where that's everyone. And then people kind of took that as like a bad thing.
Yeah, even if they didn't realize it and it was subconscious, that was kind of the general vibe from like, especially from like a lot of more prominent, I guess you could say, voices within like the BL fandom at large. Because again, we don't have subset fandoms, you know, like very few shows get their own fandom. You have the general BL fandom where everybody's kind of watching the same things. Like, unless you know you're lazy like me, I'm not watching Last Twilight. I don't care.
Don't.
And like the ending made y'all mad anyway, so I'm like, I didn't miss anything.
Someday we'll talk about like ableism in BL, and I will stand upon the rock and proclaim my feelings about Last Twilight. But that's another day.
It's not today, but a day. And yeah, it goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like there deserves to be a diversity of queer stories. And when we kind of put on this like this threshold almost of respectability, whether intentional or not, that our queer stories have to abide by, we are shutting out experiences from people within our community. And again, that kind of goes to a more macro level, but it is something that, you know, we're seeing a lot of because a lot of queer creators are now getting the opportunity to make more content, like more media, whether it's video games, whether it's TV shows, whether it's film. And I feel like we are often kind of held to the fire a little more than, you know, most folks. And I feel like that's fucking unfair. Like, y'all shouldn't harass Rebecca Sugar. I think they're fine. Like, I didn't watch Steven Universe, but goddamn.
I didn't watch
like...
Steven Universe either, but like, this is a whole separate, entirely different podcast where we're talking about the expectations adults put on children's media, but whatever.
Oh my god.
To be a little sappy for a second, I feel like so much of BL is predicated on this idea that like once you fall in love, everything starts clicking. Everything gets easier. You become your best self. And there's a line later in the show where one character, like there's a couple that has been set up and been very many things that have happened. And the one's like, I'm sorry, being with me is dangerous to you. And the other has a line that, as it's translated, is, you're difficult to love, but I'm doing it anyways. And that to me is a really good thesis statement for the way these characters are treated, the characters that they are, that says it's okay if you're difficult to love. It's okay if you have baggage. It's okay if you have really intense baggage. It's okay if you have secrets. It's okay if you have trauma. It's okay if you've been hurt. It's okay if you fuck up. It's okay to be queer and difficult. You don't have to have a fairy tale romance to be doing right by the queer community. Just by virtue of being queer, you're fine. And I really like that.
I agree. And I feel like that's a good place to leave off this episode because that was very poignant. Give yourself a pat on the back.
Hell yeah.
And yeah, I think fuck it. Go watch Playboy. Give it a shot.
Go watch Playboy.
Yeah. And if you don't like it, you don't like it, you know? But like I say give it a shot because it did get a bad rap and I think that's unfair. And we wanted to talk about that. Like especially, you know, in terms of like we have been talking about what camp is for a very long time and we had to get that out. All right.
We
like
did.
But yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. We certainly had a lot of feelings.
This is like I have a whole page of notes and this conversation covered about 2 of them. So
So I guess like the question is whether we should have like an episode part 2.
I think it would be fun to have an episode part 2 that is a little bit more about like, I don't know, who's your favorite character on the show? Pikachu? You must pick one. Who's your favorite?
God, probably not. Like when he pulled the gun out on prom, I was like, this is it. This is my baby. This is my chibito.
When he showed up at Playboy to like scream his grief wearing that like delicate little silk scarf tied over his head like he's a grandmother going to church.
I want to take him back to the familia and make him some amarrillas and, you know, hand him one of our knives. That's what I want to do. I'll be like, this one's for you. All right. This is one of the family knives. It's Gucci. He's probably my favorite, but a lot of them are so great.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them, one of the things that I liked about the show is like one last thing is my feelings changed on so many of the characters throughout the show. And to me, that's what makes film fun. That's what makes stories fun.
Yes.
And being able to literally change my opinion on characters with new information or change my perspective on a story beat or a plot point, that's fun for me. Like that makes stories worth it.
Yes.
I love my by the numbers stories sometimes. I am a horror fan. Like when I watch a Jason movie, I know exactly what I'm getting. And that's fun for me too. But my favorite types of media is stuff that challenges me, and that's what Playboy did, and I'm really grateful for that. So we should think about like a part 2.
I think we should definitely do a part 2 that's maybe just a little bit more about like favorite characters we liked, favorite moments we like, more of the like specific story moments that we just enjoyed, because there's a lot to say about these specific characters and like specific events that happen and bad decisions that are made and bonkers things that characters are like, yes, this is the way to handle this. If nothing else, we got to talk about that fucking party and that like never
God.
have I ever 7 minutes in heaven thing. One small spoiler. I think the moment people who are into Playboy like truly and thoroughly lost their fucking minds was during that party when suddenly they're like, well, daddy's gonna do this, and Porsche dropped that like, yeah, he's my fucking sugar daddy and you don't do shit for him. Like, that was so amazing. So if you do want to watch it, it is on Gaga Ooh La La. It is, I think it's like $7 a month for a subscription. And if you have the subscription anyways, they've got Bed Friends. They have quite a lot of like Japanese anime that I really liked, like The End of the World with You. There's a lot on there, and it's not just BL stuff. It's like kind of broadly gay stuff. So it's not just like stuff from Asia. There's like French and English and all that kind of stuff. There's a bunch on there that's really worth watching. There are also a lot of fantastic short films on there that are the kind of thing that are so fucking difficult to watch if you want to. So we're not sponsored. I mean, hit us up, Gaga. So even if you end up not liking Playboy, hopefully there will be some gay content on there that you would enjoy anyways.
All right, we're gonna wrap it up, and we will see you guys next time.
Hell yeah, to be continued.